Hey everybody, so I want to go on and get into our eighth section of the course, which is our last section on inequality, and we're going to focus on sex and gender in this section. Now, a term that doesn't just apply to sex and gender, it actually applies to all of these inequality sections we're doing, but it's really important that you know is intersectionality. Intersectionality as a term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's being used a lot more. But once again, these are one of those terms that I want you to know what it actually means. And intersectionality is essentially the ability to be able to see different forms and different dimensions of oppression and discrimination. And so the way to think through this is, let's take a black woman, for example. A black woman has to face discrimination because of her race and because of her gender. So she has to face, discrimination, whether it be through structural inequality or personal discrimination, both because of sex and race in this, or gender and race in this example. So with intersectionality, if you have an intersectional lens, you're able to recognize that there's all these different forms of oppression and discrimination that exist. However, they're not just cumulative. They just don't add on one to the other. They manifest themselves differently. So, for example, if you are a gay black man, you may face racism in some contexts and may face structural discrimination because of racist policies in one element, but in other elements, you're going to face homophobia. And sometimes those things intersect. Sometimes one is more present than the other, but they're both always there. Intersectionality is the ability to recognize that oppression and discrimination is not an either or, it's not mutually exclusive. It crosses these, whether it be through racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, able-bodyism, all these different ways that oppression and discrimination show up. And so being able to recognize an individual that faces various elements of this is important, and you can do that with an intersectional lens. Okay, so for sex and gender, before you even dig into sexism and patriarchy, you have to know the difference between sex and gender. So sex is going to be anything sex is tied to biological reproductive characteristics, reproductive organs, and so sex is typically treated as mutually exclusive. However, about 1.5% of the population is actually intersex, where you're born with no clearly identifiable male or female biological characteristics. Now, sex is different than gender because gender has to do with the social element and the social construction of roles and norms that align with somebody's sex. So the idea to be a man means that you're exemplifying the socially constructed expectations of what it means to be male. Now, on the other hand, you're well familiar with transgender, but it's important you define it correctly and understand it. If you're a transgender, you do not identify with the sex that you were born with. So, for example, if you're a transgender woman, you may be a woman. You identify as a woman, so you ideal with the social construction of being a woman. However, the biological reproductive characteristics you were born with were not that of a female. And so it's important you know that and know how social construction is showing up in these two definitions. Now, with sexism, of course, is going to be the discrimination, that's based on gender. But just like racism, sexism can happen at the personal level. Individuals can be sexist toward others, and it shows up at the structural level. But just like racism as well, both men and women can be sexist because you can act discriminatory towards someone else based on their gender. It can happen either way. But since men still hold nearly all positions and levers of power, discrimination at the structural level is only still going to take place against women. And so if you ever hear of like a reverse discrimination argument against men, that type of reverse discrimination is a myth because there's no forward or reverse discrimination. Discrimination is discrimination. It just happens. However, in terms of a power dynamic and the structural elements, when men are still holding nearly all levers of power, then discrimination and the institutional level and structural level and through policies and laws and customs happen with men against women. And this is going to be common in a patriarchy, which we live in a patriarchy. Most modern societies are patriarchies that, very rarely do you see a contemporary society that is a matriarchy. And so patriarchy is going to not only discriminate against women based on gender. However, it's going to show up a lot in our structures, our policies, and our laws, and it's going to be treated as normal. In fact, we're often blind to it until we actually take a step back, identify it, and interrogate it. As I mentioned before, sexism happens at the personal level, just like racism happens at the personal level. Now, with sexism at the personal level, we often talked about how women are objectified, and you can think through this a lot in U.S. culture, especially when women are talked about or treated as not as a human being, but as an object. And when individuals like objectification is a reality, and predominantly it happens against women, this impacts women's everyday decisions. Just something simple like going out for a jog. A woman has to be much more strategic than a man around where they jog, what time they jog, because we know of the objectification of women, treating women as objects has led to women being victimized in those runs, women being sexually assaulted, women, and even worse than that. And so, with this kind of reality that not only does sexism happen at the personal level, but an overall culture that objectifies women and how they talk about women, how they portray women in music and TV and movies. And when that manifests itself at the personal level, this forces women to change their everyday decisions and have to make more strategic decisions to protect their safety. Things that, a man doesn't even think about. Kind of like we talked about in race. Being white in America means there's certain things you just don't think about, like interaction with a police officer, things that just you typically do not worry you but Black Americans have to face. The same thing happens with men and women. There is everyday decisions that women have to make, such as when to get an Uber, when to go for a jog, whether to get an Uber alone or not, when to go to the bar, just things that are supposed to be everyday conveniences and everyday enjoyments of life. A woman cannot handle the same as a man because of this reality. And so sexual harassment it happens overwhelmingly to women. So sexual harassment cases against men do happen, and have actually risen lately. However, it predominantly happens against women. It happens to women on college campuses. It happens in the workforce, and sexual harassment is, of course, dangerous on a lot of levels. But an example of the patriarchy at work is sexual harassment often makes, just like we see with sexual assault and rape as well, it makes the victim either one, unable or uncomfortable with actually trying to call it out and change it or report the harassment, even though it's against college rules or against the law or against employment rules. And so, but a patriarchy one is filled with victim blaming, so the victim either blames themselves or just treats the behavior as normal, and therefore either you don't even know as a victim that you are a victim, and you also don't feel comfortable taking advantage of your rights to protect yourself and speak up for yourself. And I give examples, and I think this is the examples closest to me. I use a lot in your reading and lecture notes about my older sister. My older sister is a trauma surgeon, and she's in orthopedics. Orthopedics is dominated by men. In fact, she was asked on an interview one time, blatantly, why do you want to go into the specialty? This is a specialty for men, and she is absolutely amazing what she does. But it was about, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, she talked about a lot of her past experiences in the workplace. And it was constant stories about sexual harassment, about, her being objectified in the language of her coworkers. And she was treated horribly, the way no human should ever be treated, and something, especially, in any realm of their life. And, first off, I asked her, I was like, well, why didn't you report it? And why didn't you, bring this up? This is not only, uncomfortable, this is flat out illegal and gross. And she talked about things like she feared retribution of her coworkers. She feared that could, essentially put a mark on her that would prevent her from moving up, prevent her from being able to get references to move around to different positions. And she had this idea, I just got to tough it out, this tough it out mentality, which is something that no men in her workplace, they did not have to deal with being harassed. They did not have to deal with being victims. But that example of the patriarchy at work, where she in her workplace was being harassed, but felt like it was not okay, and she almost felt guilty to even report that harassment because she felt like she had to tough it out. That if she reported it, in that way it's victim blaming, because you're not really a victim. It's a boys' club. It's just the work culture, and it should never be. But this is just an example of how sexual harassment not only occurs, but how it prevents victims from speaking out, and speaking out in one, making changes that need to happen in that workplace, but also holding offenders accountable. Now for sexuality, because we're going to talk about that in the section two. With you all know, or if you don't know, please at least read up, and the textbook will cover it well. LGBTQ plus, not only definitions, what it means to be a part of this community, but we need to talk about the various types of discrimination and unfair treatment that those in this community face. For example, they faced, in 2014, 1,400 officially reported. So officially reported means it's always going to be less than actual amount of incidents of hate offenses against them. But it's especially jarring when you see the rate of young people that are LGBTQ plus that are bullied at school, or just feel unsafe at school. A school, we're told all the time that everybody can go to school and get an education and do well. But if school is not safe for you, if school is somewhere you feel unsafe going, then where are your access to opportunities after that? And that's just another way that privilege plays out in this realm, is that just the being able to not only go to school and work hard and succeed, but the ability to feel comfortable if you are privileged, you take for granted. And when you feel unsafe going to school, of course, it's going to impact your work in that school setting, but it probably makes it less likely you want to keep pursuing an education, or you don't feel comfortable doing that, and that cuts off access to opportunities. And that's where you get that privilege and access to opportunities playing out with this community. And in fact, you also see that lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are 5 times as likely to attempt suicide than the heterosexual youth. And that is, of course, should be eye-opening and alarming and absolutely tragic. And this is just an example of everyday discrimination and everyday prejudices and rejection that members of this community face that others don't. And that happens at the personal level, but it also happens at the structural level. For example, you're seeing, more antiquated military rules show up now to prevent trans service people from. That's an example of a structural discrimination. It is now written in military policy, or they're trying to implement it in military policy to prevent your service during that. And they're even getting more complex with that now too, such as preventing, if you're a service person that is trans and trying to go through, various types of healthcare needs. If you're going through transition, they're trying to those in power are trying to prevent trans individuals from accessing healthcare coverage for those procedures, which is just another example of structural discrimination against you because of your gender identity or because of your sexual orientation, and it's being written in laws and policies. Now, what's interesting is research has found that discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community is sadly too widespread, but it doesn't look the same across all groups. For example, research tends to find that women have fewer anti-gay attitudes than men do, and then heterosexual men tend to have more negative attitudes toward gay men than they do toward lesbians, whereas heterosexual women tend to have similar attitudes, either positive or negative, toward lesbians and gay men. And so heterosexual men always also tend to be more concerned with conforming to traditional gender roles, and that plays out a lot in school setting with boys. Is this pressure to commit to conform to gender roles, and that sometimes can show up in this discrimination. To cap off this first video, also thinking about privilege, I'll give you an example. One of my good friends I used to live with, she is a lesbian. She's now happily married, but we had a discussion one time around firearms. Do you have a firearm? And, I told her, why do you not have a firearm? And she said, well, I have these personal beliefs about the roles of firearms in our society. However, she said, I feel like I have to have it because I fear of somebody seeing me and my wife out. I fear of somebody trying to invade my home, somebody trying to trying to take advantage of us, or do even worse because we are lesbians. And that is something I didn't even think about. Just her, the privilege I get every day to walk around and not feel scared. That I can hold the hand of my fiance and I don't fear retribution. I don't fear somebody acting out against me, acting violently toward me. And she does not have those same privileges in her everyday life to even show affection to the one she loves. And that, you can see how that just manifests itself at the individual level. And then in part of this class, keep thinking through how larger structures in our society are shaping those interactions. Okay, I will pick up with the second part of this lecture in a minute. Have a great day.